8 Life-Changing Lessons from the Buddhist Philosophy. Have you ever felt like life is moving too fast? Like you're running, chasing, fixing, but still feeling stuck? What if the wisdom you've been searching for isn't out there, but has been quietly waiting inside you all along? In this video, we're not just telling stories. We're inviting you into 8 timeless teachings from the Buddha, 8 truths so powerful they have transformed lives for over 2,600 years. These aren't just religious ideas. They are practical, soul-awakening lessons for anyone who's ever suffered, ever loved, ever felt lost, or wanted to start again. From learning why pain is not your enemy, to discovering the freedom in impermanence, to the radical truth that you are not your past. This is a journey back to your inner clarity, peace, and strength. This isn't a video you'll want to skip through. It's filled with insights that could shift the way you think, feel, and live, starting today. So grab a quiet moment, take a deep breath, and stay with us until the very end. You may walk away seeing your life with completely new eyes. And if even one lesson speaks to your heart, do me a favor. Tap that like button, drop a comment to share your favorite insight, and subscribe to join this growing circle of wisdom and awakening. Because truth isn't something we just hear, it's something we live. 8 life-changing lessons from the Buddha told across 8 powerful chapters. Chapter 1, Suffering is a teacher, not an enemy. Chapter 2, Nothing lasts forever, and that is a blessing. Chapter 3, The mind is everything. Chapter 4, Attachment is the root of suffering. Chapter 5, True happiness comes from within. Chapter 6, Wisdom grows from silence. Chapter 7, Live mindfully with every breath. Chapter 8, You are not your thoughts, not your past. Begin with Chapter 1, Suffering is a teacher, not an enemy. No one comes into this life free of suffering. From the first breath we take, often through tears, until the last one we exhale, life gives us both beauty and pain. But the Buddha, out of his boundless compassion, did not shy away from suffering. He turned his eyes directly toward it and saw something most of us miss. That suffering is not the enemy. In truth, it is one of our greatest teachers. The first noble truth doesn't sugarcoat anything. Life is dukkha. But this truth, so often misunderstood, is not a declaration of despair. It's an invitation to look more closely, to be present with what is hard, and to begin to understand it. The Buddha never taught us to escape pain. He taught us to wake up within it. He didn't say, run from your sorrow. He said, look into your sorrow until it shows you your own heart. When the mind is clouded by resistance, pain feels unbearable. But when the heart is open and steady, that same pain becomes something else entirely. It becomes a doorway. Through that doorway, we begin to see clearly. We begin to know ourselves. The illusion of permanence starts to soften. The ego begins to loosen its grip. The heart begins to understand what it means to truly live with compassion. I remember once sitting with an old Zen teacher who said softly, "Every tear you've cried was holy, not one drop was wasted." It struck me deeply. For so long, I had seen my own grief as weakness. But in that moment, I saw that each wave of sorrow had softened something inside me. Pain had made me more tender, more aware, more human. There's an old story from the Buddhist tradition of a man who came to the Buddha, distressed and angry, saying, "Why is there so much suffering in the world? Why must I feel so much pain?" The Buddha calmly replied, "I cannot remove all your suffering, but I can teach you how to walk through it without being destroyed." That teaching is still alive today, not just in monasteries, but in every human heart willing to listen. To suffer is not a sign of failure on the spiritual path. Quite the opposite. It is the raw material from which wisdom and compassion are forged. When we meet our pain with mindfulness instead of resistance, and tenderness instead of shame, it reveals things we never would have seen otherwise. The parts of us that still cling, the places we hold fear, the lies we've believed about what we need in order to be okay. And when we look deeper, we see something else. The suffering we carry is not just our own. It is the inheritance of a world that is always changing. Every person you meet has a silent story of pain. Sometimes it's loss, sometimes regret, sometimes trauma that has no words, but it's there. We're not alone in this. Kisa Gautami learned this when she came to the Buddha, weeping and carrying the body of her only child. In her grief, she begged the Buddha to bring him back. Instead, he told her to go to every home in the village and find a mustard seed from a family that had never known death. She returned empty-handed, but awakened. No one had escaped grief. Her pain, which had felt so singular, was suddenly part of a larger human fabric. That realization didn't erase her sorrow, but it transformed her suffering. In shared suffering, she found connection. In connection, she found the beginning of healing. Modern life encourages us to numb our pain. We distract ourselves with phones, with work, with endless scrolling. We're told to stay positive, move on, get over it. But the Dharma says something much more radical. Sit down, feel it, be here, don't look away. Because suffering, when we let it speak, becomes a teacher of the highest order. It humbles us. It softens our sharp edges. It teaches us patience, empathy, and surrender. And most importantly, it helps us see that we are not the center of the universe, but we are deeply connected to everything in it. One of the most powerful shifts happens when we stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and instead ask, "What is this teaching me?" In that moment, we begin to walk the path of awakening. Slowly, perhaps, and not without stumbling, but we walk with eyes open. There is a quiet dignity in suffering born with awareness. It is not passive resignation, but courageous presence. The Buddha often taught that pain is like being shot with an arrow, but most of us don't stop there. We shoot ourselves with a second arrow by resisting the first. This shouldn't be happening. This is unfair. I can't handle this. The second arrow, the mental anguish, is often worse than the first. But if we can just feel the first arrow, breathe into it, notice its sensations, welcome it like an old teacher, we begin to free ourselves from the cycle of reactivity. We begin to suffer less, not because life gets easier, but because our relationship to pain changes. In the Tibetan tradition, there is a practice called Tonglen, which means giving and receiving. In it, you breathe in the suffering of others and breathe out compassion. At first glance, it seems counterintuitive. Why would anyone want to take in suffering? But this practice trains the heart to open, even in the face of discomfort. It reminds us that we are not separate. That someone somewhere is feeling just what you're feeling now. And when you breathe in their pain and breathe out love, you are not only transforming your own heart, you are helping heal the world. I have sat with people in hospice rooms where the air was thick with the closeness of death, and I've seen it happen. A quiet smile, a peaceful exhale, a word of forgiveness whispered after decades of silence. In those rooms, suffering and love dance closely. And often it's only through suffering that we remember what matters most. The teachings of the Buddha are not theoretical. They are deeply personal, deeply practical. When the ground under your feet disappears, the Dharma becomes your only anchor. And in that moment you see, suffering has not come to destroy you. It has come to open your eyes. The great Zen master Shunryu Suzuki once said, "When you suffer, you should suffer. That is beautiful." What he meant was not to glorify pain, but to encourage us to meet it honestly, fully, without shame. There is beauty in that rawness. In that truth, in that willingness to be with what is. True compassion is born here, not in avoiding pain, but in turning toward it. Not in offering quick fixes, but in bearing witness to someone's sorrow without needing to change it. And when we learn to do that for others, we must also learn to do it for ourselves. If you are suffering now, know this: you are not broken, you are not being punished. You are on sacred ground. Hold yourself gently. Breathe. And trust that even in the darkest night, the Dharma is still alive. It is in your breath, in your awareness, in the still, small voice that says, stay. Every spiritual path eventually brings us here, to the heart of suffering. Not because the universe is cruel, but because this is where the deepest truths live. Here, we learn impermanence, not just as a concept, but as a lived experience. Here, we understand that joy is not the opposite of sorrow, but its twin. And here, we begin to embody the quiet strength of the Bodhisattva, the one who stays present with suffering, both their own and others, and says, I will not turn away. Suffering does not mean the absence of light. Sometimes, it's the very thing that cracks us open enough to let the light in. And when that light comes, not as a blinding blaze, but as a soft candle in the dark, it illuminates everything. Not just the pain, but the beauty woven through it. So let us walk with gentleness, with reverence. Let us bow not only to the joys in life, but also to the sorrows. Because in every sorrow, a teaching waits patiently to be seen. And in every tear shed with awareness, the seeds of awakening are quietly being watered. Chapter 2. Nothing lasts forever, and that is a blessing. There is a kind of sadness that stirs in the human heart whenever we see something beautiful, because even as we're admiring it, we know it won't last. The cherry blossoms bloom for only a few days before the wind carries them away. The sound of a child's laughter echoes for a moment before fading into the silence of memory. A shared meal, a kiss, a sunrise, a season, they are all here and then gone. Impermanence, or anicca, is often misunderstood. At first it feels cruel. Why must we lose everything we love? Why must we say goodbye to people, to moments, to versions of ourselves we worked so hard to become? But in the eyes of the Buddha, impermanence is not a curse. It is a blessing, a liberation. It is the very fabric of freedom. Imagine for a moment a world where nothing changed, where every heartbreak lasted forever, where every sickness remained, where every injustice was frozen in time. How unbearable that would be. Without impermanence, there would be no healing, no second chances, no rebirth. There's a simple teaching I once heard from a forest monk in northern Thailand. Everything that arises will pass. The question is not how to stop it. The question is, how will you meet it while it's here? This is the essence of wisdom. Not clinging, not resisting, but bowing to the truth of change. When we learn to live with impermanence, not just as an idea, but as a lived experience, we begin to soften. We stop fighting the river. We stop trying to freeze the flow of life into something permanent and perfect. And in that surrender, we find peace. I remember a story told in the Theravada tradition of a king who asked his advisors to find him a phrase that would always be true, no matter what he was going through. Something that could comfort him in sorrow and humble him in joy. After much contemplation, they returned with this: "This too shall pass." At first, the king was puzzled. But over the years, as he watched fortunes rise and fall, as he buried loved ones and welcomed new life, he understood. Whether we are sitting in the fire of grief or dancing in the light of love, nothing stays. And that's not something to fear, it's something to honor. Impermanence teaches us to pay attention, to love more fiercely, to listen more deeply, to hug our children tighter, to forgive a little sooner. Because we don't know if we'll get another chance. The truth is, we never meet the same person twice, not even ourselves. Every moment, every breath, every encounter is brand new. The Buddha used to speak of the human body as a chariot, assembled piece by piece in constant motion, never static. He taught that clinging to a fixed identity, I am this, or this is mine, is like grabbing onto a cloud and expecting it not to move. We suffer not because life is impermanent, but because we pretend it isn't. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, as the Buddha approached his final passing, his disciples were overcome with grief. But the Buddha, serene and radiant, reminded them, all conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence. It was not a cold farewell. It was a reminder that even his physical form must pass, yet the truth he revealed remains timeless. Sometimes when I sit in meditation, I simply watch the breath. Inhale, exhale, rising, falling. Each breath is born and dies in the span of a few seconds. It is the most intimate teacher of impermanence. And the more I observe, the more I feel it. Nothing is stuck. Not this pain, not this thought, not this moment. There is something beautiful in knowing this life is a series of waves, rising and falling, appearing and dissolving. It means we are free to live fully now without waiting for the perfect moment. This moment, fleeting as it is already whole. There's a Zen koan that asks, if everything changes, then where is the true self? The answer, whispered not in words but in silence, is exactly in the change itself. We are not static beings. We are rivers. We are wind. We are the flicker of a candle in a dark room, and that flicker is enough. Letting go doesn't mean indifference. It means intimacy without ownership. It means loving without fear. To love deeply in a world where everything is impermanent is the bravest thing we can do. And yet, it is the only kind of love that is truly free. The lotus blooms not in defiance of change, but because of it. The sun does not resist its setting. And the leaves, when they fall in autumn, do not cling to the branch, they let go with grace. What would it mean for you in your life right now to bow to the change that's happening? What grief could soften if you stopped holding so tightly? What joy could deepen if you allowed it to be enough, even if it only lasted a moment? To live with the truth of impermanence is to live awake. It is to walk through this world with eyes wide open and heart unguarded. It is to savor the cup of tea while it's warm, to smile at a stranger, to speak the truth you've been holding back, to stop waiting for someday and begin truly living today. As I write this, the wind is stirring the branches outside my window. Clouds are shifting across the sky. Somewhere a baby is being born. Somewhere else someone is taking their final breath. The great turning wheel of life continues. And through it all, the Dharma whispers gently, nothing lasts. And that is the very reason to love it all. Chapter 3. The Mind is Everything. The Buddha once said, "With our thoughts we make the world." At first glance, this teaching might sound poetic, metaphorical, but the more we practice, the more we come to see it as profoundly literal. Our perception, our reactions, our suffering, our joy, it all begins in the mind. Long before anything happens out there, our inner world has already shaped the meaning of it. The mind is not just something we possess. It is the lens through which we experience reality itself. And depending on its clarity, we either walk through life awake or asleep. The Dhammapada opens with a truth that resonates through centuries. All that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. What we think we become. This is not a motivational quote. It is a spiritual law. It means that before we change our circumstances, before we blame others, before we try to rearrange the world, we must look inward. Because the seed of every joy and every sorrow is planted in the mind first. We've all experienced this. One day a person cuts us off in traffic and we're enraged. Another day the same thing happens and we shrug it off. What changed? Not the event, but the mind that met the event. One day we feel lonely and think, no one cares about me. Another day we feel the same loneliness and think, this is a sacred invitation to come home to myself. Again, same experience, radically different result. This is the power of the mind. In Buddhist psychology, the mind is not just a tool. It's the foundation of liberation or imprisonment. A mind filled with greed, anger, and delusion sees enemies in every shadow. A mind cultivated in mindfulness and compassion sees opportunities for awakening everywhere. The difference is not the world. It is the mind that meets the world. There's an old parable of two monks walking along a muddy path. They come across a woman who cannot cross a stream. The older monk lifts her and carries her across. Hours later, the younger monk blurts out, "I can't believe you carried that woman. We're not supposed to touch women." The elder monk smiles and says, "I set her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" This is what the untrained mind does. It carries old stories, old judgments, old attachments, long after the moment has passed. It clings. It replays, it reacts, and every time we follow it, we suffer. But when we begin to observe the mind, something miraculous happens. We create space. A gap opens between thought and reaction. And in that space lies the possibility of freedom. In meditation, this process becomes visible. At first, the mind seems wild, jumping from memory to fantasy to worry and back again. But with time and patience, we begin to see the patterns. We realize we are not our thoughts. We are the awareness behind them. We are the sky, not the passing weather. This insight is everything. Because when we identify with our thoughts, we're at their mercy. A single fearful thought can unravel our whole day. A single angry story can poison a friendship. But when we witness the thought without clinging to it, it loses its power. We can smile at it, breathe with it, and let it pass like a leaf floating down a stream. The Buddha taught that cultivating the mind is like tending a garden. Whatever we water grows. If we water resentment, it flourishes. If we water peace, it blooms. And so we must ask, what am I feeding in my mind each day? Fear or faith? Criticism or kindness? Delusion or clarity? One of the most powerful practices in the Buddhist tradition is bhavana, mental cultivation. It is not just about thinking positively. It's about deeply reshaping the mind through mindfulness, concentration, and ethical living. It is about planting seeds of wise thought and watching them bear fruit in our actions, our relationships, and our view of life. As a teacher once told me, your mind is not your enemy, it's just been unsupervised for too long. That's why we meditate, not to escape thought, but to befriend the mind. To become the compassionate observer who can say, ah, here is worry again. Here is craving. Here is self-doubt. And instead of obeying, we listen, with awareness, with care. The Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's past lives, are full of characters who overcome great hardship not by brute force, but by clarity of mind. Whether as a wise elephant, a generous king, or a humble merchant, the Buddha in every form teaches the same lesson. Calmness, insight, and compassion are born in the still mind. It is also said that Mara, the demon who tried to tempt and distract the Buddha, never truly disappeared. He still visits, even after the Buddha's enlightenment. But now the Buddha sees him, smiles, and says, "Ah, I see you, Mara. Come, let's have tea." That is the fruit of a trained mind. Not that negativity never arises, but that we no longer mistake it for truth. We see it, name it, and sit beside it without fear. And the more we do this, the more we become trustworthy to ourselves. We begin to live from a place of inner steadiness. We become less reactive, more responsive. Less judgmental, more curious. Less fragmented, more whole. The mind, after all, is not fixed. Neuroscience now confirms what the Buddha taught centuries ago. The mind is plastic, it changes with practice. What we repeat, we become. That's why every thought matters. Every act of awareness shapes the next moment. So, what happens when we truly realize that the mind is everything? We stop trying to control the world and start transforming the way we meet it. We become less interested in being right and more committed to being free. We stop chasing conditions for happiness and begin to cultivate happiness itself, as a quality of presence, not of circumstance. In the end, this is the essence of the path, not to manipulate outer conditions, but to purify and train the mind until it becomes an ally on the journey home, until it becomes a place we can trust, even in the dark, until it reflects the clarity of the awakened heart. And when the mind is still, even for a moment, we see things as they are, not through the fog of fear or desire, but through the eyes of wisdom. We see that all things arise and pass, that nothing is worth clinging to, that love is spacious, that peace is possible, that we too can awaken. Because the world is not something we find, it is something we create, moment by moment, thought by thought, breath by breath. And when the mind is clear, the world is no longer something to fear. It becomes instead something to love. Chapter 4. Attachment is the root of suffering. The Buddha did not say that love causes suffering. He did not say that connection is dangerous or that we must abandon joy. What he saw and what he taught with the clarity of a still lake was that clinging, not love, is what binds us to suffering. It is not the presence of things or people or emotions that hurt us. It is our resistance to their change, our fear of their loss, our insistence that they stay exactly the same. When we hold too tightly, the hand cramps. When we hold gently, it can feel the warmth of what's there and let go when it's time. The Pali word tanha, often translated as craving or thirst, is the burning energy of attachment. It is the mind saying, I must have this. This must not leave. If I lose this, I won't be okay. We cling to relationships, to youth, to identities, to status, to memories, to hopes of the future. And every one of these attachments carries with it the seeds of suffering, not because we are wrong for caring, but because nothing in this world is built to last. Imagine grasping a handful of water. The tighter we squeeze, the more it slips through our fingers. But if we cup our hands softly, the water rests there, shimmering. Life is like that. There's a story of a grieving man who came to the Buddha after the loss of his son. He asked, "Why must I suffer like this? I loved him so much." The Buddha answered, not with cold detachment, but with profound compassion. When you love, know that you will lose. But that doesn't mean you should not love. It means you must love without possession. This is not easy. We are beings of deep longing. We long for safety, for meaning, for permanence. And in this longing, we build illusions, castles in the air made of stories and expectations. We say, you are mine. This is who I am. This will last forever. But the winds of impermanence care nothing for our stories. They blow through anyway. And when the castle crumbles, we suffer, not because of the wind, but because we thought the walls were real. The Buddha's invitation was not to stop loving, but to love with open hands. Not to stop enjoying life, but to enjoy it with the understanding that everything we touch is temporary. To hold it with reverence, not with grasping. In the Mahayana tradition, Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, weeps not because he is attached, but because he sees the suffering that arises from others' attachments. His tears are not from ownership, but from empathy. His compassion flows freely because he does not cling. And this is the paradox: the less we cling, the more deeply we love. When we stop trying to possess life, we begin to truly experience it. We become fully present, not distracted by fear of loss or hope of gain. We kiss the beloved not because we want to keep them, but because this moment is precious and we are awake for it. I remember one of my first teachers saying, "Clinging is like grabbing smoke. You exhaust yourself and still your hands are empty." At the time, I was clinging tightly to an identity, a role I had played in the world for years. The fear of letting it go was unbearable. Who would I be without it? But with time, with practice, with silence, I realized the role wasn't me. It was just a costume the self had worn for a while. And when I laid it down, something truer had space to breathe. Attachment is not only to things or people, it's also to beliefs. I am not good enough. Life is unfair. I must succeed to be worthy. These stories bind us tighter than chains. The Buddha spoke of these as mental fetters, invisible ropes that limit our freedom. We don't see them, but we feel their pull. Every time we act from fear or pride or the need for approval, we are dancing with our attachments. So what does it mean to let go? It doesn't mean indifference. It doesn't mean cold detachment. True letting go is an act of the heart. It is seeing clearly that clinging brings suffering and choosing freedom instead. It is the soft, courageous act of saying, "I love you and I don't need to own you. I cherish this moment, and I don't need it to last forever. I am enough even without this story." Letting go is not a one-time event. It is a daily practice, a breath-by-breath surrender, and it's okay if it takes time. The lotus doesn't open all at once. It unfolds, petal by petal, in its own rhythm. So do we. One of the most beautiful metaphors in the Buddhist tradition is that of the raft. The teachings are like a raft that carries us across the river of suffering. But once we reach the other shore, we don't carry the raft on our back. We leave it behind. Even attachment to the Dharma must eventually be released, because freedom isn't about having the right beliefs. It's about emptying the heart of grasping. It's about walking through the world with hands open, heart soft, mind clear. And what we find over and over again is this: when we stop clinging, we begin to receive. When we let go, we become light. When we release the demand that things stay the same, we become intimate with the truth. The truth that everything changes. The truth that nothing belongs to us, not even our thoughts. The truth that love is not diminished by impermanence, but made more beautiful because of it. So sit with your attachments, not with judgment, but with gentleness. Ask them what they're afraid of. Ask them what they need. And then, like a wise and loving parent, meet them with understanding. You don't need to force them away. Just watch. Just breathe. Just notice how they come and go like waves, and one day you'll feel a little more space, a little more peace, a little more freedom. And in that space, the Buddha's words will ring clear, not as an abstract idea, but as a living truth. Attachment is the root of suffering. But freedom is always available, right here, in the next breath, in the letting go. Chapter 5. True happiness comes from within. We spend so much of our lives chasing happiness, chasing approval, chasing a number in a bank account, a title on a door, a certain face in the mirror. If only I get this job. If only I find the right partner. If only I fix my past, change my habits, make more money, move to a better city. The list never ends. And yet time and again, even when the if only comes true, the happiness is fleeting. The glow fades. The old cravings return. Something still is missing. The Buddha saw this pattern with piercing clarity. He saw that as long as our happiness depends on conditions, on things outside of ourselves, we are bound to suffer. Because conditions change, people change, the body ages, fortunes rise and fall, and no matter how tightly we hold on, none of it lasts. He taught instead a revolutionary truth, one that still challenges the very foundation of our modern world. True happiness does not come from getting what you want. It comes from knowing you already have what you need. This kind of happiness isn't flashy. It doesn't look impressive from the outside. It can't be measured or photographed, but it is unshakable. It is the quiet joy that arises when the heart is at peace, when the mind is still, when we are no longer trying to become someone else or get somewhere else, but are fully alive in this moment, just as we are. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, "There is no fire like passion, no grip like hatred, no net like delusion, and no river like craving. But there is also no treasure like contentment." This is the great paradox. The more we chase happiness, the more it slips away. But when we stop grasping and begin to turn inward, when we cultivate peace rather than pursue pleasure, joy begins to rise naturally. It arises not because we forced it, but because we cleared the space for it. I remember a story of a student who came to a Zen master asking, "Master, how can I find happiness?" The master led him to a still pond and said, "Look into the water. What do you see?" The student replied, "I see my own reflection." The master stirred the water with a stick. "Now what do you see?" "Nothing, only ripples." The master smiled. "That is your mind when you seek happiness in the world. Only when it becomes still can you see clearly what's always been there. True happiness is not added from the outside. It is uncovered from within. There are those who live in the simplest huts with little to call their own, and yet their eyes shine with peace. And there are those who seem to have everything, yet live in constant anxiety. The difference lies not in possessions, but in perception. Not in what we own, but in how we relate to ourselves and the world. The Buddha called this santuthi, contentment. It doesn't mean complacency. It doesn't mean we never grow or aspire. It means we do so from a place of wholeness, not lack. From gratitude, not grasping. When we rely on external things for joy, we become fragile. We live in fear of loss. We compare, we strive, we feel we're never enough. But when we touch the stillness within, we begin to see the conditions for peace are already present. The breath, the body, the miracle of being alive. I've sat with elders nearing death who no longer care about achievements or possessions. What they remember are simple moments, laughter in the kitchen, holding a child's hand, watching the rain fall on a quiet afternoon. These moments weren't remarkable, but they were real, and real joy is always found in what's real. The Buddha did not promise us a life without pain. He promised us a way to meet life with equanimity, to find peace not by rearranging the world, but by understanding our own minds. To see that the heart, when untangled from craving, radiates a joy that is untouched by circumstance. This is not to say we shouldn't enjoy life's pleasures, but we must know their nature. They are like butterflies, beautiful, delicate, and passing. We can enjoy them, but we cannot pin them down. If we try, we crush their wings. So what does it look like to find happiness from within? It looks like mindfulness, being fully present with whatever arises. It looks like compassion, offering kindness to ourselves and others, even when it's hard. It looks like simplicity, letting go of what doesn't nourish the heart. It looks like humility, knowing that joy doesn't make us special, it makes us human. And it feels like coming home. A monk once said to me, "The greatest joy is the joy of nothing missing." It took me years to understand what he meant. But now I see. When the mind is no longer grasping, when the heart is no longer chasing, a quiet contentment arises. Not because everything is perfect, but because we are no longer resisting what is. The Buddha's face in ancient statues is always serene. eyes half closed, a soft smile. Why? Because he was no longer at war with the world. And when we stop fighting life, when we open to it, we too begin to smile, not with giddiness, not with false positivity, but with a deep knowing joy, the kind that holds both sorrow and sweetness, the kind that can sit with loss and still feel love, the kind that doesn't need applause or validation because it already knows its worth. This joy is your birthright, not because you've earned it, but because you are alive, because you are breathing, because you have within you the same capacity for peace that every awakened being has ever known. So sit quietly, place a hand over your heart, feel the breath enter and leave, and know this moment just as it is enough. You are not broken. You do not need to become someone else to be happy. You only need to return to the place in you that was never missing. Chapter 6. Wisdom grows from silence. In the modern world, silence is often treated like an inconvenience. We rush to fill it with music, with notifications, with opinions, with noise. Silence makes people nervous. It makes them uncomfortable. It's as if we've come to believe that only what is loud and fast and visible has value. But the Buddha taught something radically different. It is in silence that truth speaks. It is in stillness that insight arises. It is in quiet, not in clamor, that the heart remembers what it's always known. When the Buddha left behind his princely life, he didn't step onto a stage or grab a megaphone. He stepped into the forest, into solitude, into long days and nights of silence. Not because he was avoiding the world, but because he was learning to see it clearly, without distortion, without opinion, without ego. And from that silence, awakening arose. True silence is not just the absence of noise. It is the absence of resistance. It is the spacious, ungrasping openness where the mind stops chasing and simply rests. And in that rest, we hear what has always been present, the Dharma. There is an ancient story of a disciple who asked his teacher, "What is the highest teaching?" The teacher raised his hand, said nothing, and remained still. The student bowed in understanding. That gesture, that moment of sacred quiet, held more than 1,000 words ever could. In the Zen tradition, silence is not a lack of expression, it is the expression of the ineffable. When the mind grows quiet, a deeper voice emerges. Not the voice of thought, but the voice of knowing, of wisdom, of presence. But to reach that silence, we must be willing to sit through the noise, not just external, but internal. Anyone who has ever tried to meditate knows this. The moment we close our eyes, the mind begins its chatter. Planning, remembering, regretting, judging. It's noisy in there. And yet, if we don't run from it, if we breathe, stay, and witness, the noise begins to settle. Like mud in a glass of water, it begins to sink. And slowly, the water becomes clear. We see the mind not as an enemy, but as a restless child. And we learn to hold it, not with judgment, but with gentle discipline. In silence, our defensiveness softens. Our performative layers fall away. The masks we wear to survive in the world become too heavy to hold. And beneath them, we find something ancient and tender, our original mind. The one that has always been watching. The one that knows stillness not as an escape, but as home. There is a reason so many wise ones, from monks to mystics to sages, retreat into silence. It is not to escape the world, but to return to it with clearer eyes, with a quieter heart, with deeper love. Silence doesn't isolate us. It reconnects us to the breath, to the body, to the sacredness of now. A friend once told me about his 3-month silent retreat in the mountains. The first 2 weeks, he said, were unbearable. His mind screamed. His body fidgeted. His emotions surged like waves in a storm. But slowly, through the repetition of mindful breath, through walking in nature without speaking, something shifted. The silence stopped feeling like absence. It began to feel like fullness, like presence, like communion with something vast and loving and kind. And when he returned to the city, to the noise, he said, "Everything felt louder, but I no longer needed to respond to it. The silence had moved inside me." This is the gift of true silence. It doesn't just live in caves or monasteries. It can live in us in the middle of the world, in a quiet walk before sunrise, in the pause before speaking, in the way we truly listen, not just to words, but to what's behind them. Wisdom arises in these spaces, not from collecting more information, but from releasing the clutter of certainty. Not from proving ourselves, but from knowing we are enough as we are. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." And sometimes, even that one word is unnecessary. Sometimes the deepest teachings need no sound at all. In fact, the most transformative moments of our lives are often wordless. Watching a loved one breathe in their final moments, witnessing the first cry of a newborn, sitting with someone in pain when there is nothing to say. These are the holy silences, the sacred spaces where presence is the only thing that matters. When we practice silence, not just as a discipline, but as a way of being, we begin to listen more deeply. We hear the suffering behind someone's anger. We hear the longing behind their laughter. We hear the still, small voice of intuition guiding us back to balance. And we begin to speak differently too, more slowly, more truthfully, more kindly. Because when we've tasted silence, we know how precious speech is. We no longer waste it on noise. We use it to bless, to heal, to connect. In this world that rewards speed and noise and opinion, silence is an act of rebellion. A return, a refuge, and perhaps the most radical thing we can do today is to stop, truly stop, and be still. In the stillness, there is nothing to fix, nothing to prove, nothing missing, only the breath, only the heart quietly beating. Only awareness, wide and tender. Only this sacred silence holding all things just as they are. Chapter 7. Live mindfully with every breath. If you could only keep one possession in this life, one thread to hold onto when all else falls away, it would be your breath. Not your house, your name, your titles or stories. Your breath, it is the first thing you are given when you enter this world, and the last thing you give back when you leave. Between those two moments, there are tens of millions of breaths. Each one is a chance to come home. The Buddha understood the profound power of this ordinary miracle. He taught, again and again, the practice of anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, not as a simplistic exercise, but as a direct path to liberation. Because when we return to the breath, we return to the present moment. And when we return to the present moment, we return to life itself. We are a culture of distraction. We move fast. We plan. We remember. We regret. We consume more than we digest: food, information, emotions. And yet for all our movement, so many of us feel stuck, disconnected, unfulfilled. Why? Because we've abandoned the moment we're actually living in. But when we breathe consciously, even just for one inhale, one exhale, we interrupt that trance. We step off the spinning wheel of doing and drop into the spaciousness of being. Suddenly, we're not lost in thoughts about yesterday or fears about tomorrow. We're here with the breath, with the body, with the miracle of now. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha says, "When breathing in, one knows I am breathing in. When breathing out, one knows I am breathing out." It seems so simple, but it is a doorway not to escape life, but to enter it more fully. Try this: close your eyes, feel the breath enter your nostrils. Cool, quiet, feel your belly rise. And fall, don't try to control it. Don't judge it, just feel it. This very breath is your anchor, your refuge, your teacher. The more we practice this kind of mindfulness, the more we begin to see. Life is not lived in the grand moments, but in the small ones. In the sip of tea, in the rustle of wind, in the pause between thoughts, in the breath before we speak. And mindfulness, sati in Pali, is not some special state. It is the art of paying attention on purpose with love. It is seeing what is here, not through the lens of habit or assumption, but with beginner's eyes. With mindfulness, we don't brush our teeth just to finish the task. We feel the water, the motion, the care. We don't walk to get somewhere. We feel the ground beneath our feet. We don't eat just to fill the stomach. We taste, we chew, we receive. And most importantly, with mindfulness, we begin to respond rather than react. A harsh word doesn't immediately spark defensiveness. A difficult emotion doesn't immediately spiral into self-judgment. We notice, we breathe, we make space, and from that space, wisdom can arise. Thich NH letter 1EA5T, H letter 1EA1NH, one of the most beloved teachers of our time, often reminded his students, breath is the bridge which connects life to consciousness. He would ring a bell and invite the entire room to pause, to breathe, not as a performance, but as a prayer, a returning. In a world obsessed with productivity, mindfulness teaches us to rest in presence. In a world driven by scarcity, it teaches us contentment. In a world flooded with noise, it returns us to silence. And in a world aching for connection, it brings us back to the heart. Even amidst chaos, even in the hospital, the traffic jam, the grief-stricken night, there is always one thing available to us, this breath. And through this breath we find choice. The choice to soften instead of harden, to listen instead of interrupt, to forgive instead of defend, to show up for life as it is, not as we wish it to be. Every breath is an invitation. Come back to your body, come back to your truth. Come back to the life you're already living. And as we continue to breathe mindfully, a kind of intimacy develops, not only with ourselves, but with all beings. We begin to sense the breath in others. We realize every person we meet is breathing too. They too carry burdens, hopes, memories. They too are held by this same invisible rhythm. Breath unites us. Breath humbles us. Breath softens our illusion of separation. In Buddhist monasteries, daily activities are infused with mindfulness. Washing the bowl, walking the corridor, sweeping the floor. Each one becomes a ritual, not because of the action, but because of the attention. It's not what we do, it's how we do it that transforms the ordinary into the sacred. And so let this be your practice, not just on the cushion, but in the kitchen. Not just in silence, but in speech. Not just in stillness, but in movement. Breathe when you're joyful. Breathe when you're afraid. Breathe when you're heartbroken. Breathe when you're grateful. Let your breath be the thread that stitches every moment into the robe of your awakening. Because the truth is this, we don't need to escape our lives to be spiritual. We only need to be present for them, fully, tenderly, without rushing past the only moment we ever truly have, this one, this breath, this sacred now. Chapter 8, you are not your thoughts, not your past. There's a quiet kind of suffering that many of us carry, often silently. The belief that we are our mistakes, that we are the sum of our regrets, our bad decisions, our shame, or the voices in our head that have repeated one lie so many times we've started to believe it's the truth. You'll never change. You're too damaged. You've always been this way. These are not truths, these are thoughts, and thoughts are not who you are. The Buddha taught anatta, non-self, not as a cold rejection of identity, but as the most compassionate truth we can realize. There is no fixed, permanent self. We are not frozen statues. We are rivers, constantly flowing, constantly changing. Every breath is a death and a rebirth. Every moment is an invitation to begin again. And yet how tightly we cling to the story of me. The roles, the wounds, the labels. I'm the anxious one. I'm the angry one. I'm the failure. I'm the victim. But these identities are just passing clouds in the vast sky of awareness. They may have been true once. They may not be true anymore, and they are never the whole truth. You are not your fear. You are not your trauma. You are not the worst thing you've done or the worst thing that was done to you. You are the space in which all of that arises. You are the awareness that can observe the thought, feel the emotion, witness the memory, and not be consumed by it. Imagine this, a clear blue sky. And across it float clouds, some light, some dark, some stormy. The clouds come and go, but the sky remains untouched, unchanged. That sky is your true nature. The thoughts are just weather. In meditation, we learn to watch the thoughts rise and fall, like waves on an ocean. At first, it feels like we are the waves, but slowly with practice, we realize we are the ocean, deep, vast, unshaken. This realization is not just philosophical, it's liberating. Because when we believe we are our thoughts, we feel stuck. We fight ourselves, we judge ourselves, we try to fix or erase or deny parts of ourselves. But when we realize thoughts are just passing phenomena, like sounds or smells or breezes, we no longer have to obey them. We can meet them with curiosity instead of fear. There is a story in the Buddhist tradition of a man who carried a heavy rock everywhere he went. It weighed him down, exhausted him. When asked why he didn't let it go, he said, "Because it's mine." We do this with our stories, our suffering, our past. We carry them not because they serve us, but because they're familiar. We confuse identity with truth. But you are not your history. You are the awareness that holds it. And awareness is never stained. It cannot be broken. It cannot be lost. Even if your past includes deep suffering, even if you've caused harm, you are not beyond healing. The Dharma does not deny karma, but it also does not condemn. It teaches that every moment carries the possibility of redemption, not through self-punishment, but through presence, through intention, through love. The Bodhisattva path begins not with perfection, but with the willingness to stay, to meet ourselves messy, uncertain, afraid, and to say you are worthy of compassion, even now, especially now. If you look closely, you'll see the past exists only as memory, the future only as imagination. The only thing that is truly real is this breath, this moment, this aliveness. So why let something that no longer exists define who you are now? In the Angulimala Sutta, the Buddha encountered a man who had killed hundreds. And yet upon seeing the Buddha's presence, the man's heart opened. He renounced violence, became a monk, and walked the path of peace. The villagers, afraid and angry, rejected him, but the Buddha said, "He is no longer who he was." That is the Dharma, that is grace. The recognition that change is always possible, that the worst in us is not the deepest in us, that no matter where we've been, we can choose where to go next. To realize you are not your thoughts is to begin to disarm the inner critic, the voice that says, "You'll never be good enough." The voice that replays every failure on loop. The voice that whispers, "You don't deserve peace." That voice is not you. It is a visitor, and like all visitors, it can be greeted kindly and then allowed to leave. Try this practice when the mind begins to swirl. "Hello, thought, I see you. Thank you for trying to protect me. You may go now." Or simply, "This too is just a thought." Each time we name the thought without becoming the thought, we reclaim our freedom. We create space. And in that space, we begin to hear a different voice, quieter, wiser, softer, the voice of the heart. That voice says, "You are not broken, you are becoming. You are not late, you are unfolding. You are not lost, you are returning. When we touch that truth, even for a moment, the chains of the past begin to loosen. The guilt begins to melt, the shame begins to wash away, and what remains is not perfection but presence, not certainty but compassion. So breathe, let the story soften, let the thought pass, let the past rest. You are not your old wounds. You are not your old roles, you are not even your name. You are the one who sees, the one who feels, the one who can begin again, right here, right now, with this breath. So now you've heard them, 8 life-changing lessons from the Buddha. Simple, yes, but never shallow. These are the teachings that don't expire with time because they speak directly to the human experience, your fears, your longings, your deepest questions. If you felt even one moment of clarity in today's video, let that be a seed of reflection, a seed of healing, a seed of remembering who you truly are. You are not your worries, you are not your failures. You are not your name or your past. You are awareness itself, and that awareness has the power to transform your life, one breath at a time. If this video moved you, please don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs a little peace. Leave a comment, what lesson touched you the most? And subscribe to this channel so you never miss another teaching that might just change your day or your life. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people living with wisdom, with compassion, with presence. And that begins right here, with you.